This is a Restless interview. Welcome back to Restless, a postmortem on the young, restless, and reformed. I'm your host, Matt, as always joined by Pastor Michael. Pastor Michael, today is a very special day for Restless. Did you know that?
Well, I do, because I'm kind of on the behind the scenes and I can see who's with us on the video. But why don't you share with everyone else why today is such a special day?
Well, for me personally, it's special because I'm getting to use the undergraduate degree I got in sociology today. It's one of my degrees. And it will come in use today as we are interviewing Dr. Brad Vermurlen, who is a sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin. He actually wrote his PhD dissertation on New Calvinism, which has now been published as the book, The Reformed Resurgence, by Oxford Press. Welcome, Brad, to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you for making time for us. Yeah, we're looking back at New Calvinism, and we thought it would be a great chance to get you on to talk about the movement because we want to look back, but we want to do so accurately. And we know you have done a lot of research on it for your PhD and the book. Yeah,
it was a years-long process. It's been an interest of mine since I started paying attention to the landscape of evangelicalism back in 2007 and 8. So it was fun to write.
So why was there this kind of academic interest in looking into this movement?
Well, it struck me as an important movement within the broader landscape of American evangelicalism. Back in 2008 and 9, I was aware of big name evangelical pastors like Mark Driscoll, John Piper, Tim Keller, Matt Chandler, and the influence they were having among younger Christians. As a young grad student in sociology, I would go to these conferences on religion. And one thing that struck me was that in the conference rooms, we would talk about whatever the research we were doing. It would be some really interesting projects, whether they were qualitative or quantitative, looking at what correlates with what on surveys. But then we'd step out into the hallway and the conversation would be more organic about, hey, did you hear what John Piper said last week, or what the most recent flare-up from Mark Driscoll was. And it struck me that this was a movement that even young professional sociologists were paying attention to, but as far as I could tell, nobody was studying. And it struck me as a project that I could tackle well.
Wow. Tell our listeners, as we've read some of it, how you went about researching the movement.
Right. So I had been paying attention to the movement for 2 or 3 years before I started working on the project, but the project started in the fall of 2012 when I flew out to Seattle to spend some time at Mars Hill Church, where Mark Driscoll was the pastor. So I spent 2.5 months there doing all the church events I could and interviewing many of the leaders of the church. After that, I did similar things at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, where Tim Keller is. And then I did the same thing at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis with John Piper. So those were the 3 main sites of what we call participant observation. But on top of that, I also did interviews, like I said, with evangelical leaders, 75 of them in total, with slight oversamples from leaders within those churches. But it was a good range of evangelical leaders from all across the country, Calvinist and not, people who were committed to the movement and also leaders who were critical of it. And I also supplemented that with a deep dive into the digital and print world of American evangelicalism. So read a sample of evangelical books that seemed relevant to the movement, as well as lots of blogs, videos, sermons, everything you can find on the internet, which is a lot about evangelicalism today. So those were the 3 main sources of data. It was a qualitative project: interviews, participant observation, and content analysis. And so by the time it came to analyzing the data and writing, it was around 2014. And so I just had a huge pile of data to sift through and started writing. So it took me more than 2 years to finish and defend the dissertation. That was in 2016. Then after grad school, I did sit on the project for a little bit, but I was able to revisit it and revise it in certain ways. I cut off 10,000 words on the front end and added 10,000 words on the back end, and ended up getting it published as a book with Oxford, which was the goal all along. So it was great.
Yeah, that is great. I think it's safe to say that on New Calvinism as a movement, Brad is the expert, the living expert on it as a movement.
So what year was it, or years was it, when you were doing the on the ground research?
It was fall of 2012 through around 2000, the end of 2014. Although I did pay more attention to the digital and print world of American evangelicalism up through the end of grad school. So that was spring of 2016, and I really had to, at some point, just cut it off and say I'm no longer going to immerse myself in this world. So I pretty much stopped the beginning of 2016.
Yeah, we've talked about the plethora of books and conferences and just everything that was pushed out for the longest time. So it would have been quite the undertaking to try to continue to sift through all of that for a long period.
Right. The Gospel Coalition wasn't going to slow down publishing blogs to read. Well, Brad, I think for our listeners, one of the most important questions we can get your thoughts on are, so what was or what is New Calvinism, or the Young, Restless, and Reformed, as people might know it?
Right. So that's a good question. I think it's reflected well in the title of my book, which is Reformed Resurgence. So it's basically a resurgence, in some sense, of Reformed theology. What does that mean? It's an increase somehow, and we can get into this, of the Reformed confession of the Christian faith, and especially Calvinism, along with things that come along with Calvinism and American evangelicalism, like certain views of gender and sexuality and mission. It's an increase of that somehow within American evangelicalism since the turn of the millennium. We can get into more about this, but one of the main findings of the book, I argue, is that there has been an increase numerically in Calvinism, and especially a Calvinistic view of salvation over the decades. There have been people, I'm not a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, but I've read people who are saying that there's a notable increase of Calvinism in those types of settings, an increase in book publishing along Calvinistic lines. So there are hints that there is a numerical increase, but one of the main arguments I make in my book is that the increase is only partly about the numbers, and that some of the most interesting things about the Reformed Resurgence are the, I guess you'd say, more qualitative increases in prominence, increases in influence, increases in visibility. And so it's increase in a variety of ways of Calvinism in American evangelicalism.
I think that will be one of the most important insights we'll get to talk to you about from your work, is what kind of a resurgence it was. Michael, you wanted to ask a little bit about his assessment of evangelicalism on a whole before we got there, though?
Yeah. Before we get into that, because I do think that will be obviously incredibly important to your whole thesis. But as we're talking about this as a resurgence within evangelicalism itself, in some of the work that you sent us, one of the things that you point out is the idea that the increase or this resurgence, this kind of neo-reform movement within evangelicalism actually shows in part the weakness of evangelicalism itself as a movement, or whatever you want to call it. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit and speak about evangelicalism as a whole?
That's right. Yeah. So one of the basic moves the book makes is that it's impossible to make sense of or explain the Reformed Resurgence in isolation as just looking at a religious movement in itself. In order to make sense of it, you have to ask, okay, resurging in comparison to what? And so you have to look at the New Calvinism within the broader landscape, or what I call it, a field of American evangelicalism. So other pockets and expressions of evangelicalism in the United States is the proper context for understanding what it is the Reformed Resurgence is resurging against. So I do have kind of a pessimistic view of American evangelicalism as a whole, in the sense that I think the New Calvinism was in many ways a reaction against certain trends in other pockets and expressions of evangelicalism. So certain more progressive views of morality, gender, sexuality from the most progressive expressions of evangelicalism. It was in some ways a reaction against the emergent church and their interest in postmodernist philosophy. It was a reaction against the seeker-sensitive model of many kind of suburban evangelical megachurches. It was a reaction against a lot of atheological or sentimentalized views of in other expressions of evangelicalism. So if you understand the Reformed Resurgence as in some sense reactionary, you start to see elements of evangelical faith that proponents of the Reformed Resurgence viewed as subpar and that they wanted to push against. And so you have all these elements, seeker-sensitive, progressive views of certain important issues, an atheological ethos that shows a lot of variety, to say the least, in American evangelicalism. And I would say that it even shows some divisions, some crucial divisions within American evangelicalism. So while the Reformed Resurgence represents religious strength, overall, by the end of the book, you see a picture of field-wide weakness and fragmentation.
These other movements they're reacting against, you describe as the kind of did you call them the other major tribes or the other major segments of the field?
That's right. So I do use the language of tribes, which I, of course, borrowed or stole from Mark Driscoll for this book. So some of the major ones I identify are what I call the progressive emergent tribe of American evangelicalism, which some might say is actually, it resembles mainline liberal Protestantism, and I think it does in many ways, but they also are within the orbit of evangelicalism and were a crucial part of the emergent conversation 10 or 20 years ago. And so in that sense, I think it's important to include them in the analysis. So I refer to the progressive tribe. I refer to the neo-Anabaptist tribe of American evangelicalism, which would be a lot of the people who kind of center around Missio Alliance and people like David Fitch or Greg Boyd and other people who are self-consciously neo-Anabaptist. I also use the language of tribe in a more loose way. It's not really a tribe, it's so big, for what I call mainstream evangelicalism, which is the kind of the large infrastructural backdrop of evangelicalism in the United States, just kind of generic evangelicalism, what most people think of when they think of evangelicalism who aren't Reformed. So, and then within that, there's also kind of a more identifiable tribe, which is what I call prosperity Pentecostalism. So people like Joel Osteen and other people who are more Pentecostal and lean more toward a health and wealth approach to Christianity. So there are those and other tribes or pockets or expressions of evangelical Christianity that are on top of the Reformed expression.
And so why the evangelical field as a whole, why is that a picture of, as you called it, religious weakness?
So if you view religious strength as putting forth a unified faith, having doctrinal and moral agreement on crucial issues, having camaraderie, Christian unity, a sense of shared mission, if that's strength, then evangelicalism as a whole is weak.
Yeah, that picture too of looking at the new Calvinism as it sits amongst these other tribes just makes a lot of sense in my own experience of the movement. So much of what I heard early on was presenting things like Calvinism literally like as opposed to these other options that you're being given right now. And I've mentioned even on the podcast earlier that, one of the things I'm thankful for of, some of what I received from the new Calvinist movement was a better, understanding of doctrine, where when Rob Bell, for instance, was being extremely popularized in the circles that I was in, or when, Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller, or these, whatever other kind of, emergent figures were becoming, these, really big names, I don't think that I would have been able to tell, oh, there's a problem here if I had not had some kind of the backing that I received from some of these men. But even right there, you see that it was always in contradiction to these other, rising tribes within the movement. So that's really fascinating to me.
Right, and I think that's an important point, that you can't really understand or explain this neo-reform movement apart from it placing within its broader context, first within American evangelicalism as a field, but also American culture as an ecological context with various factors influencing it. So things like kind of a therapeutic ethos, or the gender and sexual revolutions coming out of the 1960s, and a few other things that kind of seep into the evangelical field in certain ways, a kind of maybe a consumerist approach or a entrepreneurial spirit and those types of things. So there's context within context, which is what sociologists do.
Brad, do you think this is just a question that pops into my mind? Is a system that is inherently reactionary, so its primary identity as a movement is built around what it is against? Would you consider that like inherently weak in itself, or what? I mean, what do you think of a movement if its primary identity is in reaction to something else?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would say that the neo-reform movement was primarily reactionary. I feel like that's a bit strong. I'd say it's. I mean, it's hard to put percentages on such a thing, to say it's half reactionary and half a strong program. But it's something like that, where it's in significant part reactionary against, progressive and atheological trends within evangelicalism, but it's also in significant part a strong theological and cultural program on offer to younger evangelicals. So they're publishing books that aren't just critical; they're publishing books that are constructive and theological and pastoral and formative. So I wouldn't want to say it's primarily reactionary.
Right. I think that it's so interesting that, for me, right, as you're saying, that compared to evangelicalism, it had some religious strength because of the unity, right? So it's able to call to me out of general evangelicalism, and maybe what we'd say the reactionary element is saying, and this is the track to get on. Not don't go to the progressive route, don't go a Pentecostal route, and a Baptist route. Come this route for doctrine, mission, unity.
Yes, there was certainly an element of that. And one thing I talk about in the book is that Colin Hansen's observations of the movement, first with his 2006 article in Christianity Today, and then following up with that 2008 book, he not only observed the movement, but he also helped to create and fortify it in a sense. So even though there were these religious leaders and a lot of the on-the-ground lay people were obviously present prior to 2006, nobody talked about or could talk about the new Calvinism or neo-reformed evangelicalism prior to 2006 or 2008. And so in that sense, along with, Hansen's work and a few other things like the Time Magazine article I know you've mentioned, really almost in a sense created this new movement. It gave it a name, gave it an identity, and a lot of younger evangelicals saw that, they latched onto that, and they dove right in. So there's a lot of these social dynamics that come into play about how the movement actually got created.
Yeah. Let's talk about, which is one of the major theses of your book, what kind of religious resurgence was the new Calvinism? Because again, right, how it's promoted is suddenly numerically there's this huge amount of young new Calvinists, and you present that there are at least different ways we should think about it as well.
Right. So as a grad student, I didn't have the financial resources to field huge surveys that could actually come up with a numerical answer to how much of this was a numerical resurgence of huge swaths of young evangelicals becoming Calvinists. And in a sense, there are other surveys from Pew and other places that include the Reformed slice of evangelical Protestantism, but even there, the new Calvinism isn't just all Calvinists or all Reformed people who are evangelicals. It's an identifiable, almost circumscribed collection of big name pastors, conferences, mega churches, and those types of things. So it was hard to get at numerically, and I gestured toward that in the book, but I think that might still be a project that somebody could do somehow. But it's not the biggest expression of evangelicalism, and it might not even be the fastest growing. I mean, the Hillsong movement, Pentecostalism, I think progressive expressions of evangelicalism are growing. I couldn't tell you if they're growing as much as Calvinism, but in order to be a resurgence, you need to not only have increase, you need to have increase percentage-wise more than the other pockets and expressions are growing percentage-wise. And I just don't think you see that among Calvinism and American evangelicalism. So the question that I tackle in the book is, what kind of resurgence is this? Obviously, it's in one sense, it's a resurgence of conservative Calvinistic theology, but sociologically, what kind of resurgence is it? And as I have hinted at, it's a resurgence of prominence and influence and what I call, borrowing from French sociologist Bourdieu, symbolic power. So it's an increase of these more qualitative and symbolic elements in the field compared to the other expressions.
Can you give us examples of what that symbolic power, that influence looks like? Sure.
So symbolic power is something that is built on top of something called symbolic capital. So symbolic capital is basically just the esteem or recognition that you have in your field. And then you can build on top of that symbolic power. So it's the power to do things with your words. So when the president or dean of your university says, "You've made the honor roll," well, you've made the honor roll because they have such administrators have the symbolic power to make such declarations. And there's other things like that, justices of the Supreme Court or something. But so I would say when someone like John Piper says "farewell Rob Bell" on Twitter, and it goes off, it just goes viral, and there's tens of thousands of interactions with it, and then Rob Bell is functionally expelled from the evangelical fold because John Piper has declared that he is, no longer sufficiently evangelical. That'd be an example of symbolic power. Now, obviously, it's contestable. People are going to say, and people did say, "Who are you to say Rob Bell is no longer, whatever he wants to be?" So that's just one example. Another example of symbolic power that I get into in the book would be the big pushback when World Vision, at least its U.S. branch, changed temporarily its policy on whether employees could be in same-sex marriages. And we saw a huge pushback over the course of just a couple days that was a wielding of symbolic power in order to essentially reverse that decision. Tens of thousands of sponsorships were removed within just a couple days. And you had a big conservative pushback. And that doesn't just happen out of nowhere. That involves all sorts of, first, the symbolic capital, the esteem and recognition in your field to say, hey, this is not the way to go. And then built on the shoulders of that, the symbolic power to make things happen within your world.
So the leaders of New Calvinism, maybe the right way to say it, is they were able to gather outsized influence inside the evangelical field, both as influencers. John Piper at that point is playing somewhat of an evangelical gatekeeper, and they've found ways through online interaction, through starting new conferences or different things like that they have positioned themselves in this kind of position.
Right. So a big part of my project was strategic positioning in the field. So one of those things is that some, not all, New Calvinist leaders strategically position themselves, even if subconsciously or unintentionally, as gatekeepers to evangelical orthodoxy. The Rob Bell thing and the World Vision problem, I guess, show that. But there's other strategic positions as well that the New Calvinists took up. So as some of the biggest heralds to urban ministry and moving into cities, especially Tim Keller, and then you have Mark Dever in DC, and John Piper was close to downtown or in downtown Minneapolis, and lots of other, so being in cities is a strategic position, like physically, but also ideologically. And there's a lot of other strategic positioning too. Presenting yourself publicly as just kind of the obvious. If you're going to be a serious evangelical, if you're going to take the Bible seriously, then you're just going to end up being something close to this new Calvinism. And talking that way on the internet a lot serves as another sort of strategic maneuver, again, even if unintentionally or subconsciously, that young evangelicals were listening to, and they're saying, yeah, I guess that makes sense. If I want to take God seriously and take the Bible seriously, then this is where I need to be. And there's a handful of other things too that were, I guess you'd say, strategic positioning in the field at the level of religious leadership. So this is things going on, even far above the ordinary lives of evangelical lay people.
Right, and outside of even the normal ecclesiastical structures, right? That they're gaining this power in all kinds of ways.
So a big part of the movement is Baptist and less so non-denominational, where you have less oversight on who can do what and who can say what and where lines can be drawn.
Yeah, we've mentioned before how there does seem to be this kind of trading of influence, almost, where you get together and say one of these large conferences, you go to a T4G, you go to a Gospel Coalition conference, and through that you are able to spread your influence outside of what would have been typical 20 years before, 30 years before, where it's you're in this denomination, right? You've got these people that will listen to it, or maybe you're in this city. And so you've got a certain, amount of people that will know who you are, what you're doing. And by kind of, engaging in these other platforms, you're able to expand your audience significantly more than you ever would have been able to beforehand.
Sure. Yeah. And that gets at the importance of the internet and other sorts of digital media in this movement. I say in the book that the new Calvinism is or was at least as much an online movement than it was a flesh and blood movement. It would have been nearly impossible for such a thing to coalesce without the internet.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear about it, because Michael and we often think we aren't typical, but that our involvement with it primarily was through the internet, through online means. And it's just fascinating to hear of the movement as what Michael and I kind of were doing. We're helping usher in a new group of gatekeepers and influencers into evangelicalism.
Yeah, there is this kind of back and forth, or kind of a symbiotic relationship between the leaders and the lay people, right? So obviously you have religious leaders, pastors, seminary professors influencing lay evangelicals. That's somewhat obvious, but you also have the kind of on the ground evangelical lay people forming the substance of this movement and elevating religious leaders. And one thing I found, I should note, is that a non-negligible percent of the people involved in this movement actually didn't know they were a part of a Calvinistic movement, right? So you have people attending T4G conferences or TGC conferences, or even attending a Calvinistic megachurch. And I had conversations with some of these people, and I would ask them, do you know what Calvinism is? And they were like, not really. So it's not a lot. I mean, it's less than half by far, but there is some element there. That is one process, one mechanism. Minority of the lay people who formed the substance of the neo-reform movement were not that into Calvinism or even knew what it was. And so there is that element there.
It was the new big conferences to go to in evangelicalism. I think one question I have is, as we've been discussing it and we've been looking back on it, we kind of had this realization that it shares most of the hallmarks of a lot of evangelicalism. That we've started talking about it as it's the introduction of Calvinistic soteriology into basically broad evangelicalism. Even with what you're mentioning with there being mega churches, these things. Yeah, how much of evangelicalism's normal hallmarks does the movement have?
Well, all of them in the sense of
Sure.
the Bebington quadrilateral, if you want to
Yeah.
go there, right? So you have it's four things: crucicentrism, conversionism, activism, and biblicism. And the New Calvinism fits that to a T. Obviously, there's some diversity or contention about what those things could mean exactly, but I mean, there's no doubt that the neo-reform movement is evangelical Protestant. So there's a lot of nuance there. There's other expressions of evangelical Protestantism, like we talked about, that embody those four marks, and there are Reformed people who probably wouldn't really identify as evangelical because they're more in like old confessional streams or something. So, but yeah, the New Calvinism was definitely an evangelical. And I'm talking about it in the past tense, but that's something we can get into. But definitely evangelical.
Yeah, that'll definitely be something we'll go to in the last. Before I let Michael ask another question, you just compared it to an older confessional stream. How did New Calvinism, if at all, in your study, kind of interact with this older confessional, these Reformed expressions, whether they be the Dutch or more traditional Presbyterian?
Right. My book doesn't get much into that because it is a focus on American evangelicalism. But
Of course.
I do note at points that there have, for a long time, been conservative Presbyterian and Reformed people, long before anybody was talking about a neo-reform movement, and that they've always been there. People weren't always noticing them. And so there is that kind of weird tension there that's why it's neo-reformed, right?
Right.
So I also draw a distinction in, I think, what is that, chapter 2, between New Calvinism and Neo-Calvinism, because at Notre Dame, where I was doing grad school, I mentioned that I wanted to write my dissertation on New Calvinism, and a couple people assumed I meant the kind of Kuyperian Neo-Calvinism of mid-century. And so I had to write in there a little section about, so there is this Neo-Calvinism, and that's not what I'm writing about. So
you were just talking about this and brought up the fact that we are talking about New Calvinism in the past tense. So I mean, is there still a New Calvinism?
Right. So I finished most of the book, like I mentioned, in 2016, and only about 15 to 20% of it is revised or new material in the last 4 years. So there's been a lot in the last 4 years that has kind of weakened the New Calvinism, even on top of the fragmenting within the evangelical field as a whole that I think is there, in light of contentious conversations around social justice and race and identity politics. I think you have even more that kind of fragmenting within the New Calvinism itself. And actually, I have 4 appendices in my book that are more technical parts of the project. But the 4th appendix, Appendix D, is titled "Is the New Calvinism Past Its Prime?"
Yeah.
And so it's a short appendix. It's only a couple pages, but basically what I argue there is that the New Calvinism definitely has lost steam. It was kind of in its peak years right around the time that Mars Hill in Seattle dissolved into multiple autonomous churches in around 2014. So 2011, 12, 13, 14 was kind of the peak energy of the movement, the peak cohesion of the movement. And especially since 2014, 15, 16, I think you've seen a lot of settling down, if not fragmenting and kind of drifting in different ways. I think there's like a John MacArthur crowd going in a more conservative direction, and then you have like a Matt Chandler crowd going in a slightly different direction. And so there are, these tensions. But so I say that the New Calvinism, in a sense, is past its prime as the New Calvinism, as a movement. But in another sense, what's falling away is this kind of cohesive movement as a label. But there's still lots and lots of lay people who embrace the distinctives of this movement, and they haven't drifted away so much. Some have, some have, um, found other expressions of evangelicalism or gone into more classically reformed views or become Catholic or non-religious or whatever. But the loss of momentum and energy of the neo-reform movement is at this kind of really abstracted level of these social dynamics among leaders. And one of the things I suggest in the book is that the new Calvinism was what I call relationally constructed. Some would say, or might be more familiar with the term socially constructed. So it was relationally constructed from the relationships among certain religious leaders and organizations. And if the neo-reform movement can be relationally constructed, as I believe it was, then it can be relationally deconstructed.
Wow. That's so interesting. It's almost like the fragmentation in evangelicalism, new Calvinism 10 years ago is a expression to take it in a conservative direction, but the fragmentation seems almost inevitable when new contentious issues are addressed to evangelicalism, right? Whether it's social justice or these other, whatever other contentious religious conversations, when that wasn't baked in right from the beginning.
I think it's arguable whether or not it's baked in. I tend to think it is. But so you have, like you mentioned, American evangelicalism as a whole kind of fragmented and went in different directions over the course of the last 10 or 20 years in various ways. And then just in the last 3 or 4 years, you see the same thing happening in the neo-reformed camp, fragmenting, going in different directions. And at the end of the book, I talk about how the strength and prominence of the neo-reformed pocket actually speaks to a certain type of secularization, a secularization that you can either think of as something like a dissolving or what I call cultural entropy. Cultural entropy basically being what was previously a cohesive cultural system falling apart. So what happened 10 and 20 years ago over the course of the past 10 or 20 years within evangelicalism as a whole might be happening now within the neo-reform movement itself. Basically an entropy.
Do you discuss any reason why the relational networks they formed are breaking down? Is it just these new issues, or is there something about how they were constructed?
I don't get much into that in the book because, like I said, I finished most of it in 2016 and only revised it a little bit in the intervening years. So I think there's more work to be done on a kind of a follow-up of the movement and explaining to the extent it has broken down, a breakdown. But in terms of why it did that, a lot of it, I do mention in the book the democratized reading of the text in American evangelicalism. So again, this is less a problem for Presbyterians, but if you're Baptist or non-denominational, there's more limited scope of authority to say what's right and what's not. So once issues of race or social justice come up, you're going to have people coming to different conclusions and different interpretations, and it's hard to call balls and strikes.
This is fascinating. I think a lot of the things that you've said just about the peak of the movement, the fragmentation, it fits well within what we've been talking about over the last few episodes, but also we're talking about it from just a level of, looking out. We kind of experience some of this stuff. We don't have any data outside of our own experience, really. And now we can finally claim that science is on our side.
That's right.
Science tells us that we're right. So thank you.
And I think it's interesting, as what kind of the impetus of us doing the show is watching the new Calvinists we know kind of try and reorganize into these new, these groups you already mentioned, whether it's MacArthur, these groups kind of going in these different directions, and everyone kind of wondering when, hey, I thought we were all together for the gospel, or whatever. We were all in this together. And so, yeah, this has been great and super interesting to me and helpful, I think. So thank you for the time today, Brad.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Is there anywhere else people can find you online or read any of your work?
I guess the hub would be bradvermurlen.com. You can read about me there. You can see my what academics call their CV with my publications. That would be where everything's centralized. BradVermurlen.com.
Thanks again for listening to Restless. Please rate and review this show on Apple Podcasts and contact us on social media or at our email, restlesspodcasting@gmail.com.